In 2018, on a farm in Devon, Derek Gao's land looked like hundreds of others. Cattle and sheep grazed here. The next day, he sold them all. Then, Derek started doing stranger things. He took down fences, stopped managing the land, and began buying animals that Britain had almost none left of. To the neighbors, it looked like a farm going bankrupt. But Gao wanted to find out what would happen if he simply stopped interfering. And this was only the beginning of an experiment that would bring back to England animals lost centuries ago. Britain is an island that emptied itself out. In just a few decades, the country lost a huge share of its biodiversity, one of the worst records among developed nations. Beavers vanished from British rivers 400 years ago. Lynx, 1,300 years ago, before anyone was keeping written records in these parts. The wildcat survives only in the remotest corners of the Scottish Highlands. Today, no more than 115 individuals remain in the wild, despite the species having had protected status since 1988. The water vole, the same ratty from The Wind in the Willows, has fallen into catastrophic decline within a single generation. Its population has dropped by roughly 97% in this century alone, almost a complete erasure of the species from the map within one human lifetime. The cause is land turned into a conveyor belt. Gao puts it bluntly, 35% of Britain's agricultural land produces only 2% of the calories the country consumes. That land, in his words, is a mountainside, a pasture worn down by grazing, ruined by thousands of head of livestock that should never have been there. The government and conservation agencies have talked for years about restoring nature. In an interview with The Ecologist, Gao described the state's approach to conservation in 3 words: too little, too cautious, too slow. He added another idea then that became his personal creed. The question isn't how far species reintroduction can be pushed, but how much patience for wild nature society is willing to bear. In 1990, Gao, then a young enthusiast just starting out in Scottish conservation work, attended a summer course at writer Gerald Durrell's zoo on the island of Jersey, on captive breeding. Durrell wrote about the need for specialized gene banks for species on the brink of extinction, oriented not toward visitor entertainment but toward saving populations. The idea stuck so deeply that 3 decades later, Gao would build exactly such a bank, only instead of an island, it would be a field in Devon. By 1994, he was already arranging to relocate beavers to Scotland, the first such project in the country. The arrangement would take 15 years. Only in 2009 did his farm at the time finally hold the first licensed beavers in Britain, 26 animals, 17 of which sat in quarantine awaiting permission to move. In other words, long before selling the cattle at Coombs Head in 2018, Gao had already spent roughly 30 years doing one and the same thing: bringing back species Britain had lost. Selling the cows wasn't the beginning of this story, just its public punctuation mark. He drew inspiration from Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, 6,000 acres of land where nature was simply allowed to act on its own, without a plan handed down from above. "There's nothing like it in Western Europe," he said of the experience, even before he decided to try something similar at home. Coombs Head is a species recovery center, from which animals are then distributed across Britain. Gao doesn't work alone here. Ecologist Pete Cooper joined the team to help with breeding and release. "If you give nature space, give species a chance to breathe, we have a fight we might actually be able to win," Cooper says. Even then, Gao understood that permits from above alone would accomplish nothing. Farmers, hunters, and anglers needed to see benefit in species recovery themselves, not a threat. Landowners, he said at the time, were used to thinking conservationists had a grudge against them. Instead, he offered them land management grants, forestry subsidies, and wildlife tourism as a business run by the community itself. "This is a local-level decision," he insisted. "A project designed this way, from the ground up rather than handed down by ministerial decree, moved more slowly but didn't provoke a revolt from the neighbors." The press had long since given him a nickname, the guerrilla rewilder, for his habit of acting first and seeking approval later. Derek Gao spent 5 years in ordinary farming, a career no different from thousands of others. Then he read the books of naturalist Gerald Durrell, and it changed the trajectory of his entire life. In the late 1990s, Gao ran a small wildlife park in central Scotland, later developing 2 nature centers in England. In 2001, well before any decisive steps, Gao began breeding water voles, small rodents that burrow into damp soil and threaten no one. the easiest and safest species to start with. Not all his experiments succeeded during these same years. In 2009, Gao brought in het cattle, an attempt to recreate the extinct aurochs through selective breeding. The animals turned out to be genuinely dangerous. Within a few years, the most aggressive ones had to be culled, and the herd eventually went feral again. "I tried, and I failed," Gao later admitted. Amid all these attempts, in 2011, 2 birds landed on that same farm where 1,500 ewes and 120 cattle still grazed. A hired worker didn't even recognize what they were. They were stone curlews. Gao called a friend at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. "Derek, they're 25, 30 years old," the friend replied. "They're just taking one last look at the world before they die." The curlews flew off a day or two later. Gao never saw them again. This moment, in his own words, set off all the grief tied to farming coming to an end. The experience with the voles had already pointed the way by then. As ecologist Pete Cooper put it, water voles are essentially the reason Derek got into beavers in the first place. The logic is simple. A vole creates a wet microhabitat in miniature. A beaver does the same thing, but on the scale of an entire valley. A beaver builds a dam and a pond appears behind it, then another. By bringing water back to the surface of the landscape, you create living space for everything else. Ducks, amphibians, water beetles, and dragonflies, Gao says. One species engineering opens the door for a dozen others. The next rung up is the first predator. In an enclosure among the shrubs, Gao steps inside with a bucket of dead chicks. A wildcat springs from the undergrowth and snatches the food right off the grass. "They won't take sheep. They won't take children," Gao says. Wildcats have been bred here since 2018 with a target of 40 kittens a year. The first were released in Scotland in 2023. In England, he says, the whole process, from planning to clearing it with animal welfare groups, will take at least 7 years. Then, in May 2025, came the biggest step yet. At a satellite site run by the same center that manages Coombs Head, 10 white storks were released, a species absent from this part of Britain for centuries. This is no longer a matter of damp soil or a single farm. This took years of international negotiations and government permits. The rodent taught him the principle. The beaver applied that principle on a larger scale. The predator showed where resistance runs strongest, and the stork proved the scale could be national. There are no more cows or sheep on this land. Instead, there is Galloway cattle, a stand-in for the extinct aurochs, the wild ancestor of all domestic livestock, and Exmoor ponies, Britain's oldest horse breed. Iron Age pigs mimic the wild boar that roamed these fields 4,000 years ago. None of these animals produce milk or meat for sale. Their job is different: digging up ground, trampling undergrowth, creating puddles and clearings where everything else can settle in. In effect, Gao hired animals instead of machinery. Where a tractor once leveled land to a single standard, now a boar digs a hollow, a horse tramples a path, and a cow breaks branches in ways no landscape engineer would ever plan. The difference is that the result of this work is never the same twice. 5 years after the fences came down, the effects are visible to the naked eye. On a farm where hay was once cut for livestock, skylarks appeared for the first time in the whole history of observation there. Flocks of goldfinches, hundreds of birds, pursued by hawks and kestrels, arrived on their own, following the prey. Marbled white butterflies, never before seen on this land, appeared for the first time last summer. One pond this summer was literally teeming with tadpoles. Local frogs and toads had made use of a pool dug by boars over the winter, before anyone on the team had even planned for it. That same pond is simultaneously a home for some species and a dining hall for others. The same principle as the beaver dams, just in miniature. Field mice and voles moved into grass no longer cut for hay, followed by hawks and owls that now have something to hunt. This isn't a one-off spike, it's a sign that the system isn't just holding on, but expanding on its own without further human intervention. Lynx at Coombs Head aren't released into the wild. Animals rescued from private collections are kept as an educational tool, a living reminder of a predator unseen here for 1,300 years. Wildcats are still awaiting reintroduction. In late 2025, a 2-year study by a consortium that includes Gao's consultancy along with the Devon Wildlife Trust and Forestry England confirmed that returning wildcats to southwest England is technically feasible. Black and white storks, pool frogs, and field mice all pass through the same pipeline, born in captivity, raised, then vanish into the tall grass in the wild. The farm doesn't run on grants. Instead of selling milk and meat, income now comes from shepherds' huts for guests, camping, tours to the beaver ponds, and school educational visits. The model Gao was describing back in 2009, turning nature into an economy that benefits locals rather than an abstract idea for city-dwelling environmentalists, now literally feeds the farm in place of the cows that are no longer there. Gao has described his experience over these years in 3 books, on bringing back the beaver, on turning his own farm into an ark for lost species, and on the history of the wolf in Britain, a species he isn't even attempting to bring back yet. 3 books, 3 stages of one project. First one species, then a whole farm, then the question of just how far this can really go. What Gao started 30 years ago as one farmer's solitary work is now being repeated on a national scale. In the Cairngorms National Park in Scotland, where 19 wildcats were released in 2023, camera traps recorded wild kittens born to released females for the first time in history in May 2024. That summer produced 7 more litters, 24 kittens in total. This isn't Coombs Head, and it isn't Gao personally, but it's the same movement he spent years building the foundations for, back when almost no one believed in it. But behind every released species lie years of bureaucratic warfare that never make it into the short clips of adorable baby beavers. Releasing a beaver into a wild river without a license is still illegal in Britain. The conservation agency Natural England refused for years to consider new beaver release applications until a national approach to managing the species was approved. Gao had been negotiating the first beaver relocation to Scotland since 1994 and waited 15 years. The official government consultation on beaver reintroduction to England only launched on August 25, 2021, 3 decades after Gao first took up the cause. In Scotland, meanwhile, farmers received permits to shoot beavers considered pests. In a single year, 115 animals were killed there, more than 10% of Scotland's entire beaver population. Gao reacts to this with bitter irony. When a colony of beavers turned up in the River Tamar near his farm with no license at all, he just shrugged. A badger let them loose. It was an act of God, he said, insisting no legal claims against him could possibly stick. Lynx have still not been released into the British wild and likely won't be for a long time. Land lobbies, sheep farming interests, and fear of a large predator make this conversation toxic for any minister. The wildcat remains critically endangered, despite protected status that's now over 35 years old. Gao himself doesn't hide his frustration. The conservation system, he says, is built to avoid risk rather than to act. This standoff didn't end in victory in 2018 when he sold his cows. It continues now, species by species, license by license, consultation by consultation. The Gorilla Rewilder nickname didn't appear by accident. In the trade press, he's regularly contrasted with cautious government programs, where every animal release gets approved over years through committees. Gao instead builds the enclosure and buys the animals first, then figures out how long the paperwork war for a license will take. To some colleagues, that's boldness. To others, it's exactly the disregard for process that they believe damages the reputation of the whole movement. There's another layer to this conflict too, inside the conservation world itself. The word gorilla irritates some of his colleagues. To official agencies and major conservation organizations, Gao is an inconvenient figure who acts without waiting for committee consensus. He publicly criticizes civil servants who, in his view, manage risk instead of managing recovery. He's also the first to admit, The topic of the wolf in Britain is so toxic that even he isn't seriously raising it yet, despite having devoted an entire book to it. The demonization of the predator, he says, is stronger than any scientific argument in its favor. No one is willing to name a year when the lynx will hear the forests of Britain through anything other than the bars of an enclosure. Back to that field in 2018, where trucks stood loaded, hauling away the last livestock from Coombs Head. Today, England counts at least 8 separate wild beaver populations, and some of them trace their lineage directly to the ponds and quarantine enclosures of Coombs Head. The farm is no longer one man's project. Gao now runs the operational side, Keep It Wild, together with co-founder Nick Viner, and the breeding center supplies animals for projects across the country every year. The week after one of his ordinary mornings, Gao is no longer in Devon but out among the fens of eastern England with a delegation from the Netherlands that has come to discuss bringing the Dalmatian pelican back to the North Sea coast. The idea is the same as it was 30 years ago with the beavers. Find partners on both shores, release the birds, wait for the two groups of the same species to find each other. Even his peers still cannot agree on what to call him. Alastair Driver, director of Rewilding Britain, has known Gao since the mid-1990s. Honestly, I have been called a maverick myself for years, he said, but I am nowhere near as much of a maverick as he is. He does not call it a victory. He calls it work that is not finished yet.